For years, the forests around a quiet Russian city hid a secret no one could quite name. Young women disappeared after work, from bus stops and dark roads, accepting late-night rides from a man who looked completely ordinary. Days or weeks later, their bodies turned up in the woods or by the roadside, strangled, violated, and stripped of identity. Locals whispered one word: maniac. Investigators would later call him the Lipetsk Strangler, and some media would go even further: the Lipetsk Chikatilo. On paper, his name looked harmless: Anatoly Petrovich Sedykh. This is not a story about a Hollywood monster. This is a story about a quiet driver and family man who used the roads around Lipetsk as his personal hunting ground. A man whose crimes forced investigators to rely on new forensic tools, and whose final mistake came from a single, forgotten mobile phone. Tonight, you will hear how he lived, how he killed, how he was finally caught, and why investigators still believe the full number of his victims may never be known. To understand how a serial killer could hide for so long, you have to understand where he lived. Lipetsk is an industrial city in western Russia, a regional center surrounded by forests, fields, and small villages. In the 1990s, its landscape was a mix of Soviet-era panel apartment blocks, factory chimneys, muddy courtyards, and crowded markets. People here were not rich. The Soviet Union had collapsed, jobs were unstable, salaries were late, and many families survived by taking any work they could find, from market trade to informal taxi driving. Anatoly Petrovich Sedykh was born into this environment on April 20th, 1963. His childhood was not the stuff of legend or horror. No widely known story of severe abuse, no dramatic scandals. He grew up like thousands of other boys in a working-class Russian city. School, army service, small jobs, friends, the usual street culture of late Soviet times. As an adult, he built what looked like a stable life. He got married, had children, and worked as a driver, including for a local cultural institution, which made him look even more respectable in the eyes of neighbors and colleagues. To the outside world, he was simply a middle-aged man in a jacket, behind the wheel of an ordinary car, trying to support his family. Later, investigators would find out that this ordinary man also kept several mistresses, and that at least one woman described him as a sexual pervert who once tried to strangle her during an encounter. But at the time, these details were hidden behind closed doors. In the public eye, there was nothing that screamed serial killer. Officially, Sedykh's series begins in 1998. On September 11th of that year, a group of friends from Lipetsk went outside the city for a picnic. In the forest belt near a road, they found something that would change the way police looked at the region. Lying naked among the trees was the body of a young woman. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted. There were no documents, no money, and nothing on the scene that clearly identified her killer. For investigators, it was a difficult crime, but not yet a sign of a serial killer. Russia in the late 1990s was full of chaotic violence, domestic murders, drunken fights, gang crime, and random attacks. One more murdered woman in a remote area could easily be seen as a single tragic episode. The file went into the system, but whoever had killed her did not stop. In 1999, the killing escalated. According to later reconstructions, that year alone, Sedykh strangled at least 7 more women in and around Lipetsk. The pattern was chilling. All the victims were female, usually young adults. They disappeared after leaving work, social visits, or bus stops. Many had last been seen either trying to hitch a ride or getting into a car. Bodies were found in similar locations: forest strips near highways, fields and wastelands on the edge of the city, places where someone in a car could quickly pull over, commit a crime, and disappear again. The causes of death told the same story. Victims had been sexually assaulted and then strangled, often using clothing, belts, pieces of underwear, or improvised ligatures. Robbery was present but secondary. Valuables and phones were taken, but the violence itself was the main event. By the early 2000s, the number of similar cases in the Lipetsk region could no longer be ignored. Police saw the same method, the same type of victims, the same disposal sites. They were no longer looking for a criminal. They were hunting a serial killer. Later, when investigators reconstructed his method, a grimly logical pattern appeared. Sedykh used his job and social mask as a driver to approach women who needed to get home. In the 1990s and early 2000s, informal taxis, private cars stopping to offer rides for cash, were everywhere in Russian cities. Official taxis were few and often expensive. Standing on a cold roadside, a woman might see no better option than to get into a stranger's car. Sedykh chose his hunting grounds carefully: central streets at night, bus stops where women stood alone, roads leading out of the city. He drove a Lada-type car and knew local roads well. Once a victim was inside, the car became a trap. At first, the ride might seem normal, with casual small talk. Then he would shift direction, taking side roads, turning toward the forest, or driving past the turn where the woman expected to get out. At some point, the tone changed completely. He became aggressive, overpowered the victim, raped her, and then strangled her, eliminating the only witness. He removed valuables and sometimes kept trophies, such as jewelry or a mobile phone, which he or his family would later use. For years, this simple, repeating script worked. The victims were isolated, the locations were dark and remote, and the killer was someone nobody suspected. Inside the investigation, a disturbing fact later emerged. More than once, police suspicion had briefly turned toward Anatoly Sedykh, but each time he slipped away. He did not fit the stereotype of a deranged outsider. He had a stable job, a family, and friends who were ready to defend him. When investigators quietly checked him, people around him insisted that he was incapable of such crimes. Without strong physical evidence, it was difficult to justify an arrest or to build a solid case. There were no confessions, no surviving witnesses who could clearly identify him, and no cameras to follow his car from city center to crime scene. For the people of Lipetsk, fear became part of everyday life. Women shared rumors, changed their routines, and warned each other not to get into strange cars. Parents repeated the same message to their daughters: "Don't hitchhike. Don't trust drivers you don't know." But the city still needed to move, to work, to live. Public transport did not suddenly become safer or more frequent. Reality forced people to keep taking risks, and Sedykh kept exploiting those risks. As the investigation progressed, more personal details about Sedykh began to surface. During questioning and psychological analysis, he reportedly mentioned that being overweight in his youth had caused problems with girls and left him with long-lasting grievances. Investigators later suggested that his crimes were, in part, a form of revenge against women for these perceived humiliations. He maintained a double life. On one side, a family man and official driver for a cultural institution. On the other side, a man with multiple mistresses and a pattern of violent sexual behavior. One mistress admitted that he was a sexual deviant who had once tried to strangle her during sex, a chilling echo of the way his victims died. Yet she survived, and the incident stayed hidden until after his arrest. For forensic psychologists, Sedykh fit a now familiar profile: socially adapted, not openly insane, capable of maintaining relationships and gaining trust, using control, violence, and strangulation to assert power over victims. The most disturbing part was how effectively he hid this side of himself from most of the people around him. While Sedykh lived his double life, forensic science was slowly catching up. Samples from the bodies and clothing of victims had been collected throughout the years. As DNA technology improved, experts were able to link multiple murders to a single, unknown male profile. This confirmed what the behavior pattern already suggested. The Lipetsk region was dealing with one serial killer, not a series of unrelated attacks. Russian media later condensed this turning point into a single line: the Lipetsk maniac was betrayed by his genes. But a DNA profile by itself is just a code. Investigators still needed to connect that code to a living person, a name, a face, a specific man they could arrest. That connection came from something far more everyday: a mobile phone. One of Sedykh's last known victims disappeared along with her mobile phone. For a long time, that phone was dead, switched off, unregistered, just another lost object. Then, years later, it suddenly came back to life. The device was turned on and began to access the network again. Calls or other activity from the phone drew attention from investigators who had not forgotten the case. By tracing the signal and analyzing who now had the phone, police reached the household of Anatoly Sedykh. According to accounts from investigators, it was his son who had turned the device on, not knowing or not thinking about where it had come from. The phone itself did not prove murder, but it provided a crucial link. A stolen object from a murdered woman was now in the hands of the family of a man who had long been on the fringes of suspicion. With that, law enforcement had enough grounds to move aggressively. They obtained warrants and went to search Sedykh's garage, home, and car. The search of Sedykh's property was a turning point from suspicion to solid proof. Inside his garage and living spaces, investigators found women's jewelry, small personal belongings, and other items that did not match the possessions of his family. Over time, these objects were identified as property of several murdered women whose bodies had been found around Lipetsk. His car also held secrets. Witness statements and case files suggested a similar vehicle had been seen in the area of some disappearances. Reports indicate that Sedykh had tried to modify or partially dismantle the vehicle, a sign that he understood the risk of being tied to it. Forensic testing then connected DNA from crime scenes with samples taken from Sedykh, closing the loop between lab results and the actual suspect. At this point, the picture was no longer a collection of doubts. It was a network of facts pointing directly at one man. The Lipetsk driver with a quiet face and a normal job was under arrest. Once in custody, Sedykh faced a long series of interrogations. Investigators confronted him with each episode, each victim, each piece of recovered property. He did not respond like a broken man consumed by guilt. He denied the accusations, argued with the evidence, and tried to construct alternative explanations. One senior investigator later recalled how Sedykh reacted when DNA evidence was presented. At first, he claimed he was physically incapable of strangling anyone, describing himself as an old, sick man with limited use of one arm. When this failed to convince, he tried another angle, inventing the story of a twin brother who could be responsible for the crimes instead. These changing stories showed a man who was not willing to accept responsibility, even when scientifically confronted. For the investigative team, it was confirmation of his manipulative, deceptive nature. For the families of victims, his refusal to admit guilt was another wound on top of years of grief. In April 2010, the Lipetsk Regional Court handed down its verdict in the case of Anatoly Petrovich Sedykh. He was officially charged with the rape and murder of 12 women, as well as 9 additional rapes, plus robbery and theft connected to the victim's stolen belongings. The timeline of his crimes stretched from 1998 to the mid-2000s, covering more than a decade of fear for the region. In court, prosecutors laid out the full picture, the behavioral pattern of the killings, the geographic concentration around Lipetsk, the physical items found in his garage and home, the DNA links between Sedykh and multiple crime scenes. Family members of the victims heard, often for the first time in detail, the final hours of their daughters, sisters, or wives. It was not just a question of legal guilt, it was a public acknowledgement of the horror they had lived through. Sedykh, however, maintained his innocence. He did not offer a full confession. He did not give a clear explanation for the murders, nor did he express remorse in a way that convinced anyone in the courtroom. The verdict was clear. Anatoly Petrovich Sedykh was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment in a special regime penal colony. Even after the verdict, one question haunted the case. Were there only 12 murdered women, or were there more? Serial killers rarely stop by choice. More often, they are stopped by arrest, by death, or by some external factor. Given the years during which Sedykh operated and the number of unidentified or unsolved cases in the wider region, investigators had reason to suspect that not every victim had been officially linked to him. In 2023, long after his conviction, law enforcement announced that at least 2 additional killed women had been identified as his victims through renewed forensic analysis. Their deaths had occurred within the same time frame and fit the same pattern. This update did not officially change his sentence. He was already serving life. But it did change the emotional landscape for the region. For some families, it meant finally understanding who had killed their relative. For others, it reinforced the fear that more victims might remain unnamed or undiscovered. When you talk about a number like 12, it can sound abstract. Each one, in reality, was a person with a life, a family, and a future that ended on a dark road next to an ordinary car. After sentencing, Sedykh was transferred to a high-security Russian penal colony to serve his life term. These colonies are harsh environments, long barracks, strict regimes, barbed wire, watchtowers, and an internal hierarchy among prisoners that can be brutal on its own. Men convicted of sexual violence and serial murders are often considered the lowest category in that informal prison order. They face hostility not only from guards, but also from other inmates. Isolation, hard routine, and the knowledge that there is no release date create a slow, unending pressure. For many years, there was little public news about Sedykh. He was simply another life-sentenced prisoner in a system that does not often show what happens behind its walls. Then, in 2023, reports emerged that Anatoly Sedykh had died in custody in a penal colony in Mordovia. Early information indicated suicide as the likely cause. There was no widely publicized last confession, no recorded apology, no final attempt to explain his motives. The man who had refused to accept responsibility in life left without clarifying anything in death. Today, Lipetsk is trying to be just another Russian city. There are new buildings, shopping centers, renovated embankments, and nightlights over the river. For many younger residents, the name Lipetsk Maniac is just a phrase from old news. But memory in a city does not vanish completely. For people who lived through those years, certain places, bus stops, forest strips, roadside stretches, are still tied to fear. Old warnings live on in new generations. Do not get into strange cars, especially at night. The case of Anatoly Sedykh shows how a predator can exploit the weak points of a society in transition. Poor transport, economic desperation, lack of technology, and trust in a man who looks normal. It also shows the importance of forensic science, persistence from investigators, and even small details, like a phone that someone turns on years after a murder. In the end, Sedykh's story is not only about one killer, it is about a city forced to confront the reality that evil can sit quietly behind the wheel, smile politely, and offer you a ride home. Between 1998 and the mid-2000s, at least 12 women in and around Lipetsk never made it back from that ride, and the true number may be higher. Evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it looks exactly like the person you think you can trust. When you talk about a man like Anatoly Sedykh for almost half an hour, there is a real danger in the way the story is framed. If you focus too much on the killer, his personality, his motives, his talent for hiding, you risk turning him into the main character and turning the murdered women into background details. That is not what this documentary is meant to do. Every statistic you heard, every one victim, every 12 murders, is a person whose life stopped on a road or in a forest outside Lipetsk. Each had a family, everyday problems, dreams that had nothing to do with true crime or horror. True crime content today walks a very thin line. On one side, there is a real public interest in understanding how such people operate, how police work, and how systems fail, because those lessons can help prevent future crimes. On the other side, there is the temptation to turn killers into dark celebrities, to romanticize them, to make their faces and names more memorable than those of their victims. In recent years, families of victims in famous serial killer cases have spoken out, saying that some movies and series re-traumatize them, forcing them to relive their worst memories for the sake of someone else's entertainment. Their message is simple. If you are going to tell these stories, you need to remember that they are not fiction. They belong to real people who are still living with the consequences. In the case of Sedykh, there is another uncomfortable question. How many of his crimes could have been prevented if early suspicions had been pushed further, if patterns had been recognized sooner, if forensic tools had been used faster? We will never know the exact answer, but it matters that we keep asking. Documentaries like this one cannot bring anyone back. What they can do is force us to look directly at the gap between the image of a normal man and the reality of what he did. They can remind us that a friendly driver is still a stranger, that systems built to protect us can fail, and that science and persistence can eventually expose even the most careful predator. If you watch this to the end, the most important thing to remember is not the name of the killer. It is the fact that 12 women, and likely more, never made it home because they trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment in the wrong city. Their stories should not be reduced to entertainment. They should be a warning about how fragile everyday safety really is and how easily it can be taken away.